Welcome to the Bennett reading. This gathering is always very special to me as it opens my eyes to the sampling of the inspiring talents that lie within our faculty. And coming towards the start of the year, it reminds me so much about what is yet still to be revealed by faculty and their inspiring ways. The Bennett Reading Award is given annually to one faculty member to fund a 2-year writing project. The recipient demonstrates a reverence for the written word and seeks to share that passion with students and colleagues. Candidates are selected through an application process that includes detailed plans for their writing project and samples of their work. Miss Bennett, for whom the grant is named, is remembered by her students as having an intense and devoted interest in the use of the English language, and for her ability to inspire a precise and disciplined use of words in the written expression of thoughts and ideas. She was also known for her love of poetry. Many of her former students went on to pursue writing careers, and a number of them became English teachers themselves. As a former student, Jean Hargraves Graham from the class of 1957 remembered her, quote, "Miss Bennett, twinkling through those glasses and rocking on her toes, and her passionate hatred of split infinities. To this day, I hate them too," end of quote. This year, we are marking a very special milestone of the Elizabeth Bennett Faculty Writing Grant. In Cranbrook terms, the grant is 40 years on. Thanks for the giggle, that was good. Yes, the Bennett Faculty Writing Grant was established in 1984 prior to the merging of Cranbrook and Kingswood. The following decades brought many changes, but the enthusiasm of our faculty for the written word and their eagerness to pursue writing projects during the summer has never wavered. The reading event was added 10 years later in 1994. When the grant founders surveyed the first 10 recipients, they found that while they felt summer work was satisfying, a reading event would formalize the grant experience in a way that highlighted the work and benefited the community. Over the decades, the Bennett Reading has become an important touchstone for fall on this campus. It's a chance to celebrate our readers and an inspiration for all of us who share ourselves in new ways with one another. So, decades later, we pay tribute to Miss Bennett, an inspiring teacher who helped set a foundation of care and dedication to the written word that still resonates with us in our school today. We just heard it from our cum laude speaker, a recent graduate who works in molecular engineering, Dr. Esser Khan, who emphasized in his comments to our students the importance of good writing at the core of success in any field, and the importance of the metaphor. We are also grateful to Miss Bennett's former students who chose to honor her by establishing the Elizabeth Bennett Writing Grant. Carolyn Cross Shinland and Annie Sanders from the Kingswood class of 1958. And here with us tonight, we thank Leslie Shimke Johnson, class of 64, and Karen Hagenlocker, class of 81, for their work on this grant. If you would both stand.
But she is a strong supporter.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And we thank the many friends of the Bennett who have also contributed to the fund that has nurtured this project for our faculty writers over the years. Be sure to take a look at the list of Bennett grantees from across the years. You will see 80 summertime commitments by our dedicated faculty writers, and we're thrilled to have a number of the Bennett alumni in the house tonight. If you are a past recipient of the Bennett Writing Grant, can you please stand to be recognized if you are able? There are collected writing samples and Crane Clarion articles and more from across the years on display tonight. And I know you will be struck, as I have been around the collective talent that is back on our tables and dedicated to our Bennett alumni. Thank you so much. We're proud of our faculty writers, and I encourage you, there are actually packets in the back and other handouts. I encourage you as you're heading out to grab those and take a look at some of the collective works over the last 40 years. Speaking of alumni and faculty writers, tonight we celebrate and share in the work of Audrey Bourriaud as she completes her second grant writing of the year, or grant reading, and from our first year recipient, Dr. Gania Barlow. Audrey Bourriaud. Tonight, we begin our readings with the second grant recipient, World Language faculty member, Audrey Bourriaud. She is a member of our residential faculty, beginning her fourth year as a teacher of French, as well as our international programs coordinator. Last year, Audrey treated us to selected poems, as well as an excerpt from her novel entitled Vice Versa, a story that explores the effects of climate change and threats to biodiversity through the eyes of Pomme, a young Congolian girl who grew up in the flourishing city of Kinshasa. We were all left eager for more of this compelling story, and I am happy to report that Audrey is here to deliver. Join me in welcoming Audrey to the podium.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity for the second time to read in front of you the text I have been working on for the past year. Writing is a very solitary practice that even publication cannot completely redeem. On the other hand, what joy it is to read texts aloud, to make them become alive. I want to warmly thank every one of you for coming and making it a reality for me and Dr. Barlow. I would like to thank as well the members of the Bennett Grant Committee for the support they continue to lend to writers. As I said last year, and I will repeat myself, it is very comforting to know that literature is valued at Cranbrook. Tonight, I will read two texts. The second one is a short poem that I would like to dedicate to my students. The topic is not new. It talks about the pitfalls of overachieving and the dangers of beating yourself up for not overachieving enough at the cost of your mental health. The first text is an excerpt from the novel Vice Versa that I'm currently writing. I choose 3 chapters right at the middle of the book where the two main characters, Vice and Pomme, succeeded reasonably well with their farming project. Their hopes and dreams became true. They left Congola, where they were born, for Europe, where they started a permaculture farm to help this developing continent with the resilience of its ecosystems and territories in the context of global warming. But this is near the turning point of the book. There is still a sense of hope that everything will be fine for them and the social structures in their area. However, there is also a sense of unease that prepares the second half of the book, where a chain of unfortunate events leads to a famine and chaos. The reason why I choose this particular excerpt is because I think it mirrors the moment we're at. We are living in a transitional era. We're standing on the edge of a world that became suddenly old, waiting to be tipped over into the next. We are not exactly in the carefree, extractivist, productivist, fossil fuel-based world anymore that was brought to us throughout the 19th century and reached its peak between the 70s and 90s. But it is not yet the world of after, when food security in our cities may become a problem, a matter of concern, when public health may become a problem as well with pollution. The underlying conflict between Pomme and Vice, who used to be best friends, acts as a rehearsal and announces the battle over food that the world will be facing soon. Chapter 125. At the end of the day, Vice got out for an evening walk in the field. She reached the path leading to the distant gazebo, just as the sunbeams, horizontal by now, turned the radiant rings of the giant multi-headed sunflower that steadily grew all summer, a mellow orangey yellow peach. Pom teased her regularly about this romantic, and she truly meant from another age romantic, walks. What? After a wearing endless day of bending, picking, weeding, hoeing, all you can do is go out again. Aren't you done? Vice, aren't you tired? And her own answer always, tired of beauty? Tired of the best? You should come with me, Pom. The European light didn't have the same properties as the one in Congola that Vice consistently kept missing despite all their successes and gorgeous happiness over here, except for that one of the sunset. Then all the green hues of the deciduous trees and vegetable patches around would trade their coldness for the superior colors of Africali. For an hour a day, the scorched-looking landscape came to meet the aesthetic standards that the savannah had forever engrafted in her brain. There it was, a golden realm, a true home. On her way to the gazebo, she caressed the long graminées and saw several hoopoes mingled with the usual tribes of sparrows, which she considered to be an auspicious sign. Her mind had been emptied by the immense fatigue of the harvest, so she sat in a wordless exogenous contemplation, led entirely by the moving colors of the sun setting. Once or twice, a pair of rusting wings inflected the dance of the light until there was nothing to bend anymore. The woods had given in to darkness. With a yawn, Vice perched her lamp on her forehead and walked back home. Chapter 126. When Vice reached the house, she saw that Pom had gone to the garage. All lights were on and the front door was wide open. She got inside. Pom visibly had been waiting for her. "You ain't going to give them all that, right?" Pom petulantly asked as soon as Vice entered. "You mean this?" Vice answered, pointing to the pile of food in the back of the truck. "Yes, this, all this, 16 crates." "I am." Vice, that's too much." "It's not. Have you seen the barn? When do we have the time to can all this food before it goes bad? And we have plenty for us. We ain't canning for a large family. It's just you and I." "I know you hate canning. That's okay. I'll take care of this tomorrow," Pom said, unloading the crate at the top. "Put this crate back, Pom," Vice said tartly. "Tomorrow you will be out with me in the field because of, priorities, like securing the peppers before the blight takes over. And if you want to put up a fight over this, just think of all the yield we would lose to it. Also, I'm very tired, Pom, of having to see clearly for 2 here. And I am very tired, picking beans and peas 12 hours a day for you to give away. Those are not the times for some sort of extravagant largesse. This is not generosity, Pom. If we don't share, eventually, you know what happens. Don't be a bird of ill omen. I really don't need this at the moment. If I'm not bringing them that much, soon enough, they will be at our door," Vice shouted. "And not only much more will be gone, but you and I will hit a hell of a nasty snag." "I don't agree. This is crazy. We are becoming crazy. This is a word of cooperation. Remember, the new way that keeps us all afloat." "Well, what a great demonstration you're giving right now. Stop interrupting me. This is a word of cooperation. That's how we have been coping with the floods. No one will come at us." "Oh, yes, they will. Or if they do, it will be like it's always been, to help us." "I don't think so, Pom. This can only be true to a certain point." Pom grabbed a blanket and a pillow on the floor. "You're not coming to bed?" "No. I'll sleep with Minstrel tonight. He looks worse than yesterday. I won't be able to sleep at all if I'm thinking any minute that he could die." "Okay. Wait. Here, take that." Vice unstrapped her headlamp and gave it to Pom, who shoved it into the pillowcase. Good night. Come get me if you need... But Pom had already left. For a few minutes, Vice didn't feel like moving at all. Then she did turn the lights off, crawled and rolled on a heap of string beans that barely buckled under a featherweight, and fell sound asleep. Chapter 127. The lamb lifted his head when Pom opened the pen door. She sighed in relief. The entire time she wasted on waiting for Vice, she imagined Minstrel listless. But he was bleating to her now, which made her heart melt and washed away every drop of bitterness. She curled up around the frail body, deploying the blanket around like a cape to shield both of them. In the dark, as her hands were pensively moving through the small curls of wool, she thought that Vice wasn't to blame. It was just that she didn't understand it all. 16 crates, that was 6 too many. She would tell her that precisely tomorrow. She was right about giving the extra. She too wanted to give, be a giver, be a part of something bigger than their little universe. But Vice doesn't understand. Since the floods, she had been so happy the second year, planting the orchard, so happy, and the floods, they had left her in tears. She had planted a row of almond trees. Every single spring, when they flowered, when the frost could have nipped their buds in the bud, days of holding a breath, days of talking to the sky each night to ask, no rain, please, no rain. And they survived it all, until this very last flood in April. The deaths of the almond and strawberry trees, the feijoas, which had made them so proud. Vice said to think of the other species that were still standing, not of the dead. But it had been too many ravages. She had sunk. They had carefully learned the plants of this hemisphere with joy and love, extreme patience, like devoted sisters. Vice sung to the vines. The vines died too. She to the orchard. Before, she was able to hold conversations with the sky indeed, with the growing trees or any torpid flower that needed her to breathe some desire for life into her cells. She could no longer talk to them. But I can still chat with you, Minstrel, can't I? So, what am I going to tell you? Well, I will tell you that I don't want you to be a shooting star, my Minstrel. You hear me? Be a steady moon instead. Pom bent to kiss him, and Minstrel, half awake, half asleep, seemed to smile. The poem. You better be awesome. They say, they ask, they want. And I too want it, in a way. But I feel not awesome. I feel somewhat full, in fact, and pretty empty inside. You better be good at math science, humanities, social studies, robotics, and extra human beingness. Oh, and golf, lacrosse, hockey, and hula hoop. But if I now multitask, like talking, driving, we'll take several loops around the block and we'll never get anywhere, conclusion or house. You better be someone who shapes the world, regardless of how, regardless of when, with a chisel in one hand, in the other a beacon for the highest interest, someone who achieves, who hatches into a beautiful butterfly. But a butterfly doesn't hatch. It emerges. That I could do maybe, because I am an emergent sea. So be you. You better be you. Just be do you. That is the best you can do. What else than a most authentic, singularly shaped you? Don't change a thing, a thimbleful. Patch up your fragile bits. They fit in. But what if you burden me again, only with a different name? What if I am a stranger to myself, that I don't hold for certain? You better be this, you better be that. You bite at this and that, you spit. Why couldn't I be let be? Enjoy living with no other purpose than living? I do not have to follow any of these summons. I do not even have to be me. I live, and that's all there is to be.
Thank you, Audrey. That was wonderful. I can't imagine doing that in a non-native language. It's true. It's truly remarkable. Thank you. I'm Jacob Hazard, and as the Dean of Faculty, it is my responsibility to see that faculty members are aware of the Bennett Writing Grant opportunity. There is information about the grant available here tonight, and I will send out a reminder with information about the application process later this year. It is a pleasure to introduce tonight's second reader, Dr. Gania Barlow. Tonight, Gania marks her debut as a first-year Bennett Grant recipient and reader. She is beginning her fourth year in the English department and is an advisor to the Crane Clarion. She is known among her colleagues for her originality and precision with language. Her Bennett application created a stir among readers, one of whom noted that her objective to teach her students to distinguish between subjective assumptions and objective interpretations using cues within the text was, quote, pure Miss Bennett. The motivation of the Bennett Grant led her to take advantage of a writing course with One Story magazine this summer. She was struck by the careful way her instructor developed the prompts and led her class through each exercise. She plans to leverage several of the reminders in her classroom this year, especially noting how powerful scaffolding and molding can be for learning writers. She was especially ensnared by her instructor's surprisingly productive prompts, which led her to produce a complete story based on Tamine, the sister of Odysseus, who appears in Book 15 of the epic poem. Please join me in welcoming Bennett Grant recipient Gania Barlow.
So thank you all for being here, and especially to the Friends of the Elizabeth Bennett Fund for supporting this award, which has been just a really great way to get back to the creative juices that sometimes find trouble flowing in the midst of everything else. So the project that I originally proposed for this award is something different, right? But my writing over the summer went in an unexpected direction, partly because of the class that Jacob mentioned. I took this class not really knowing what to expect from, going back to school and being a student myself again, but hoping that it would give me some sort of structure and accountability for getting the work done. And the teacher at the beginning of the class suggested to not try working on something in progress, or revising something, but to start something new. So like a dutiful student, I decided not to do the thing that I'd been thinking I would work on, which was a story in progress for the project that I proposed for the award, but rather to go back to a blank page. And I actually so the page was mostly blank, although it was like sort of one of those old palimpsests that's been erased, because I had put some thought into this character a few years back. I'm not, in full disclosure, full honesty, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce her name, which in the spelling that I have is K-T-I-M-E-N-E. So Katimini, I think, is what I've hit on. I had noticed her, having read the Odyssey so many times now, noticed her this one brief mention in Book 15 when she is mentioned as the youngest sibling of Odysseus who was brought up with Eumaeus, the noble swineherd that some of you may remember, who helps Odysseus out when he gets home. And so I was very curious about her, and I tried to find more information, but there's not that much out there. The other important detail I found is that she was married to Eurylochus of Same, who was one of Odysseus's companions, and notably the one who resists his authority at a couple of key points on Circe's island and on the Cattle of the Sun island. But of course ends up dying with everybody else along the way. So I had done this research a few years back and even done a little bit of writing, but I didn't really remember what I'd written other than my general sense that she might not be the biggest fan of her famous brother. So I started out in the class with this blank page, and I did find, as Jacob mentioned, some very surprisingly productive prompts, including an idea to add a secondary character that's helping my first character deal with their problem. And I hadn't really thought about a second character. That sort of creative constraint that the teacher offered us, I thought was really productive because it made me think about my character in a new way and made me think about who maybe would be with her. And as you'll see, she gets a companion in a sort of unexpected way. So without further ado, then, I will read you the story, which I can read in full because it is short enough. Perhaps somewhat, we'll see. Hopefully it'll be short enough. Okay. On one morning that seemed like any other morning, Katemini walked along the northern beach of the island of Same, with her husband Eurylochus perched on her shoulder in the form of an owl. In the light gusts of morning wind off the water, as her feet trudged out their familiar struggle through the cool, slipping sand, she gazed at the gray outline of Ithaca that loomed on the horizon and dreamed, as usual, of revenge. In this mythic age, there were no seasons of the year, only seasons of war or peace, seasons of divine anger or benevolence. And in a peaceful, benevolent season like this, and in the middle season of her life, early mornings were Katemini's favorite time. The island was still quiet, and the responsibilities of leadership that had been left to her when Eurylochus sailed with the fleet for Troy didn't yet clamor for her attention. Eury liked the pre-dawn hours best, too. For one thing, of course, he was nocturnal now, so this ritual dawn walk settled him down for his day's rest, even as it served to rouse Kit into wakefulness. But no less importantly, he was still both embarrassed and miffed about having been smited by the gods for eating the sun's cattle, and he was happy to have an unimpeachable excuse for avoiding Helios's smug glow. Eurylochus, as Katemini had come to think of him, had adjusted disconcertingly quickly to his new species. But it had always been hard to tell exactly how Eury felt about deeper things like self. To be fair, she hadn't had very long to get to know her husband when they were first married, just long enough to conceive a child who was born after her father left, classic Trojan War baby. But in the last 7 years since Athena had transformed him into an owl upon his death, Kit had come to feel some real affection for her husband. His feathered face had naturally had a look of perpetual dissatisfaction to it, but in spite of that, he tended to be very chipper and active and an excellent mouser, and he often let her carry him cozily on her shoulder like this. Dawn stretched one rosy finger out over the tops of the waves to tickle the beach grasses, damp from night's chilly exhale, and they trembled slightly and bowed low for a moment before snapping back up in anticipation of the feast of sunlight to come. Eury chittered in his throat and tapped her chin lightly with his beak, signaling it was about time to turn back for home. But then suddenly, just as the goddess splayed her trillion fingers wide to welcome the new day, Katemini saw the signs she'd been waiting for all these years. An eagle sliced its way through a mass of chattering gulls in the surf up ahead and carried off the largest, neck broken in its massive and merciless grip. Her brother Odysseus was finally home. Eurylochus saw it too, and, rousing his wings and letting out a sharp whistle, he clutched her shoulder with his talons. She hissed and pushed at his small body, making him stumble and flutter ungracefully down to the sand in a huff. They had both been startled by the eagle sign and weren't as in tune with each other's nonverbal cues as they normally were. She sighed and squatted, with that painful twinge in her knees that had developed in the last couple of years, and clucked softly at her husband by way of apology as she held out her wrist for him to climb back up. This was no time for them to bicker. Katimini had been planning this moment for years, in some hazy, half-conscious way for her entire life. The chance to finally give her brother the epic chewing out that the narcissistic jerk truly deserved. She had felt the need for it even when they were children, had worried the lump of feeling over in her mind, but hadn't quite had the words, the concepts to shape her sense of injustice, the sense that she was being used up as filler in someone else's story. But the words had begun to take form about 20 years ago, when Odysseus had reached out even into her new life, her own life in Same, and stolen away her husband for his crew. And when 7 years ago, he'd gotten that crew and stolen husband killed ignominiously at sea, she found that all her worrying over the years had whittled sharp a piece of her mind to a deadly point, and she was ready to give it to him. Katimini wanted to set off across the water immediately, but even though the journey was short, it was several days before they could actually embark, given the need to clean, repair, and restock the boat, gather oarsmen and find workers to replace them at whatever else they'd been supposed to be doing, give instructions to the staff, and perform full sacrifices to several relevant gods for success in all aspects of the journey. Throughout the preparations, Yuri fought his inclination to avoid the sun so as to be present and alert for everything. Unable to help, he showed his approval by flying in a weaving pattern from stem to stern and mast top to wave top, shrieking his eerie "Q, Q," and hunting out a mouse or two from below the decks. Kit's mind seethed continually through its well-worn paths of invective, screed, tirade, the exact turns of phrase polished to a dazzling shine that she hoped would impress and impact, or better yet, would cut and gut even the master of words, Odysseus himself. She imagined herself standing tall and firm in the prow, gripping the deck rail with all the strength of her resolve as the ship flew on wooden wings towards her brother's comeuppance. But she had never had a stomach for the sea, and so when they finally set sail, she lay instead pale and sweating under a sunshade, feeling the alternating shocks of cold spray and her stomach dropping. It had been just the same on her journey in the opposite direction at the age of 16, some 21 years ago, when she had been married off the week before Odysseus to clear space in the house for his formidable bride, a cousin of Castor and Pollux. Of course, the somersaulting and catapulting of her stomach back then had been enhanced by her nerves at facing the new life ahead of her as the princess and future queen of a minor satellite island within her father's domain. Intellectually, she knew that Same was remarkably close to Ithaca, but given that she had never before left those rocky shores, it fell to her heart and her roiling stomach to be oceans beyond oceans away from home. She had been told repeatedly what an honor it was, though, and so she had tried to rouse herself upon arrival at Same to look her best and greet this husband. It was not supposedly their first meeting, but she couldn't remember him, couldn't distinguish him from any number of other princelings from small satellite islands or mainland villages who paraded through Ithaca's great hall, hoping for the honor of giving gifts to her father and brother. Her head still swam so much that she had only been woozily aware of a lean, compact body in front of her, as her attendant woman put her hand into his, and she mumbled her way through the practiced greeting formula. "Son of Cepheus and lord of Same, stalwart Eurylochus, my husband, I bring you greetings from my father, godlike Laertes, king of Ithaca." He gave her damp hand a pat, glancing past her toward the ship, and his first words to this green, drooping bride had been, "Didn't Odysseus bring you?" It was understandable. He had paid a fortune for her, for the daughter of Laertes, for the proximity to Ithaca that geography should have, but somehow hadn't quite given Same already. Her bride price was admirable and well known, though she herself remained nearly anonymous, even back on her home island. She was not a great beauty, looking rather too much like her brother. And she'd always felt insufficient to the glory of her family, felt herself dwindling to nothing next to the Olympian expectations and capabilities of Odysseus. His education consisted of hunting razor-tusked boars with their thieving grandfather and his henchmen, while for Kit, it was assumed, the same regimen could more or less serve to bring up a future bondsman or a future wife, so she was raised closely alongside the child who would become the noble swineherd Eumaeus. Her childhood had been a Scylla and Charybdis of inner turmoil, jealousy of her brother's freedom and daring, but also guilt for not wanting more, for not being bold enough to make her own place in history like the heroines of old. No special pet of Athena like the rest of her family. She had always felt her patron must be Hestia, a practical, quiet goddess, often forgotten among the 12 great Olympians, who helps you stay put and keep the fire lit, plain and sustaining like porridge. So when it came time for her marriage, Katimini had of course feared what all young women fear when they're sold off and shipped away from home. But on top of that, she feared that she would be expected to behave like the daughter of Laertes and sister of Odysseus, to demonstrate her bloodline tangibly in some way that she'd never known how to do. To his credit, Eurylochus hadn't looked visibly disappointed when he saw her. On the contrary, he had honored her at the value of the price he'd paid, never expressing regret or uncertainty about it. That was what made her begin to like him, perhaps even love him in that first, and in some way only, year of their marriage. Not the honor he'd given her, but the way he had accepted her as sufficient. She had wept on the day he sailed away in Odysseus's boat, and she had wept and mourned periodically as the years dragged on and the fleet didn't return. And she had wept confusedly in the double shock of bad news, good news, when the gray-eyed goddess brought him back to her as an owl. To this day, Katimini didn't quite know how to feel about that gift that Athena had presented to her. Her husband, saved from his human death, which Kit hadn't known had happened, by having his soul transferred into the body of an owl. And not just any owl, a little owl, Athene Noctua, the owl of Athena. This seemed on paper to be quite the honor, seemed evidence of Athena's special care and attention for the house of Laertes. But the little owl was also, rather conspicuously, Katimini thought, the smallest breed of owl in Greece, and Eury was not a particularly large specimen of the species. Only Athena could have pulled off such a trick, to grant a boon that was equal parts slap in the face. This was the portion that Katimini had come to expect from her family, from her life, and this was exactly the kind of thing she planned to go give Odysseus a piece of her mind about. Throughout the short journey to Ithaca, Eury perched contentedly on a small peg on the mast. He appeared to be asleep, but knowing him as well as she now did, Katimini could tell that he wasn't. Though his fluffy brows were pressed frowningly closed, she expected that he was as alert as ever, luxuriating in the salty air and gliding swiftness of the boat, and she was glad that he at least was enjoying the trip. Unlike Kit, Eury had always been most at home at sea, a real son of the islands, raised swimming and fishing and rowing and sailing, practicing spear casts into the sand and at fat seals, crowing out lurid praise songs to the lovely Nereids. And he didn't get much sailing time anymore since his death, and since he wasn't an aquatic bird. So now she knew he wouldn't sleep through this. And she was right. The instant the crew lay anchor at Ithaca, Eury's eyes popped open and he glided down to his place on her shoulder. He remained there throughout disembarking and the long, hot, and unceremonious walk through town. She could feel his excitement in the small bounces of his body and the way he clenched and unclenched his small, bony feet more carefully than when they saw the eagle sign. His agitation had a kind of bolstering effect on Kit's own nerves, grounding her in a sense of righteousness, of justice. She felt him thrilling with her in the anticipation of unburdening herself, of at long last telling her brother about everything she'd put up with, all she'd done and endured and gone without for his sake, of the weeks of her life lost, washing his dirt and blood-crusted clothes, hands aching in the cold water of the nymph-blessed spring, how his sweat permeated her every youthful memory with a bitter tang, how he'd taken all the best things of life, the food, the presents, the songs, the time, the love and devotion of everyone they knew, including even that of the brother of her heart, Eumaeus, who hadn't even cried as she had when they were finally parted, because he knew he was going off to serve his purpose, to serve his prince, to serve up choice cuts of pork at every feast. And that was only her childhood. But of course, her grievances extended into her adult life, as the trembling Strygian body on her shoulder could attest. That means owlish body. I had to throw in a $50 word. In Eury's soft foot squeezes and the tense little bobs of his head, Kit felt him urging her on. She was his champion, his voice, his partner. He must, she knew, have his own bones to pick with her supposedly glorious brother, who had taken him away on a 10-year siege and failed to bring him home again. She could easily imagine the way Odysseus must have behaved over those years of war and wandering. And corroborating stories of his cockiness and bloodlust and temper tantrums and mistakes had long ago begun to whisper their way back, rumor traveling faster than the wave-bound ships. Eury had always been loyal to Laertes and Odysseus, but he also had his own mind, and a tendency to speak that mind, even at inconvenient times, even into the lowering, reddening face of an unhappy leader. Kit felt them moving together, feeling together, as they made their final approach to the palace. She felt strengthened by that togetherness when her heart quavered at the wide, gleaming palace doors, as the machinery of Ithacan hospitality surged forward to meet the guests, and the sun glinted blindingly off the polished shields and spears and wine bowls of Odysseus's glorious wealth, and Penelope herself rose up from her work to greet them, with all the grace and poise of a goddess, everything that a queen should be and that Ctimene herself wasn't, but it didn't matter because finally she had her chance and Eury was with her and she was ready. But then Penelope informed them that they were too late. They'd just missed him. Odysseus had left the day before on an inland journey of unknown duration to appease Poseidon for something about having taunted a blind child. Ctimene didn't really pay attention, couldn't focus on the specifics, couldn't process this anticlimax amidst the pounding of blood in her ears and the shrieking of Eurylochus, who had launched himself frenetically aloft. Kit just stood there dumbfounded for several long minutes as her husband swooped and cried among the roof beams, and Penelope smiled politely and waited, one of her many talents. Finally, Eury landed on an elaborately carved stool at the foot of a sumptuous gilded chair, clearly intended for the absent lord of the house. But even there, he continued to hop and whistle bark and rouse his wings with such urgency that Ctimene began to think she may have been interpreting his devotion to their trip all wrong. As his little body moved so delicately, almost caressingly, over the shining designs meant to reflect Odysseus' honor as they held his stinking feet, Kit began to think that Eury's passion might, after all, be focused not so much on her righteous anger toward her brother, not even on his own substantial grievances against the man, but rather on following his old captain even unto the death and even beyond it. She stood watching her husband, understanding now what it meant to have the wind taken out of your sails. Eurylochus was choosing Odysseus over her, again, like everyone else, even now. That meant no one was with her. No one understood. Eury's incessant chirping took on a grating, shrill tone, like every second he wasn't speeding after Odysseus was another stroke of physical pain in his feathered breast. And for a moment she felt it too, the compulsion to follow her brother yet again, to puzzle over his footprints and fade into his shadow and eat his dust. And Kit felt herself being pulled along in the current of Odysseus's insidious charm, which was focused into a rushing, intense torrent through the small channel of Eury's frantically pulsing owlish heart. As she felt the tugging of his desire, she reflected on how it had been so easy for her to misinterpret him. Her ardor for revenge and Eury's ardor to follow were twinned harmonies to the main siren song of Odysseus's glory. She had just chosen the more difficult part. She had been resisting him, or at least resenting him, her whole life, and now she was middle-aged and she was tired. What use would it be to yell at Odysseus anyway? It wouldn't change him. He'd likely not even hear her thin, earnest words, since his ears were tuned rather to the crash and shriek of waves and armor, to laudatory odes and the wails of the dying. Look how he'd bulldozed his way through 2 generations of his own people to get what he wanted. How could she alone ever hope to stand up to that? Better, she began to think. Better, Eurylochus's hooting assured her. Better, the golden glow of the battle lute scattered around his hall seemed to hum. Better to just follow. To let herself be swept away and dissolved into the song of Odysseus, resourceful Odysseus, godlike Odysseus, plotter of the Trojan horse, hearer of the sirens, escapee from untold monsters, beloved of Athena, the man of many ways. It felt sad, but also remarkably easy to just give in, like loosening your clenched, exhausted fingers from a sea-tossed raft and slipping beneath the waves. But just when she was about to let go, about ready to be carried along with the longing in her husband's feathered throat, she felt a kind of silver shiver shock that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Her body turned itself toward Penelope, who was slightly out of focus, like heat waves were rippling through her. Penelope seemed to grow closer or larger or both until her eyes took up Ctimene's whole vision. And then the pair of eyes winked and flashed from brown to gray. And for a long space of timelessness, Ctimene felt herself held on all sides and in every part of her being by Athena's electrostatic gray-eyedness. What use would it be, Ctimene thought to herself, in a voice and with a wisdom that were both her own and not her own? What use would it be to yell at Odysseus? It wouldn't change her. She had enjoyed her life, after all, when she wasn't worrying over her brother. And the last 7 years had been the best yet. She had a home and a thoughtful, loving daughter and people who listened to her. Her heartbeat steadied and her breathing slowed, and she began to feel her swollen feet standing still on the firm-packed earth. As the world returned around her, Kit felt her vision snap into a startling focus, like the other half of an optical illusion. While Athena was a warrior, she was also a trickster, and she was also an artisan, and she was also a woman. Kitimene did not need the glory of revenge. She did not need to measure herself against her brother anymore. And Eurylochus, she realized, had been all the husband she cared for. She would miss Eury, but she knew very well how to live without him, and she would not try to make him stay if his fluttering heart led him back to the captain he had followed and fought with and betrayed and loved for all these many years. So instead of chasing after her brother to confirm his self-importance by telling him how much of her life she'd wasted thinking about him, she gave her husband one last stroke on his mottled head and watched him fly inland until he disappeared from view. "Well then," Penelope said. Kit saw that Penelope was herself again, though when she took her guest's hand, she gave off one last electric snap. "Can I offer you anything? Tea? Wine?" It didn't surprise Kit to know that Penelope was also close to Athena. Pen's shrewdness and resourcefulness during Odysseus' long absence were, after all, the stuff of legend. It just added to the sticky mixture of awe and resentment she'd long felt for her brother's wife. She had always wanted to be liked by Penelope, but could never tell what the other woman really felt. She had always thought Penelope's manner seemed more like that of a woman in a story she was telling you about herself than that of a real person. Still, Kit was glad to have her there in this moment. She didn't regret anything that had happened, but she did feel slightly directionless and rather naked without the weight of her husband on her shoulder. She touched the empty place lightly with her fingertips. "Wine, I think," Penelope said sagely. She punctuated this by giving Kitemene's hand a slight squeeze, which seemed to say that she too knew what it was to find and lose a husband, to lose and find herself. Kit thanked her and gratefully sat down in Penelope's corner of the hall. She hadn't realized until now how her feet ached. The footrest Penelope offered her was much less ornate than Odysseus's, but much more comfortable. Kit was just noticing the deceptively simple stain-hiding pattern on its cushion when Penelope said, "When you arrived, I was just finishing up another piece, so apologies for the mess." She gestured lightly towards her loom, which stood nearby, surrounded by heaps of yarn in every color and with the most astonishing intricate fabric growing on it. The product, it was clear, of 20 years of intensive dedication to her craft. Kit looked around Penelope's great hall with new eyes, seeing now everywhere, all around, between, behind, over, and under the slick shine of armor, the thick and vibrant warmth of the woman's work. Penelope poured out a portion of wine for Athena, and Kitimene poured out a portion for Hestia, and the two women sat together in the late afternoon, drinking and eating, and talking over the joys and troubles of governing nearly grown children in island kingdoms. That evening, Kitimene only felt moderately nauseated on the journey home. Back on Same, Kitimene still chooses to walk at dawn, though now she greets the goddess with a warmer smile, unabashed by the coming sun. And she's begun to explore the inland walks, away from the watery horizon, bounded by Ithaca's raised fists of rock. Deep in the hills, she feels surrounded, enclosed, embraced, held in every part of her being. The wild grasses seem to bow to her as she passes, and the little flowers wink their dazzling eyes and dance. And instead of slipping futilely always backward in the dunes, her footsteps now move sure and firm up and down the paths of her island. Thank you.
Thank you both, Gania and Audrey. Those are both so marvelous. I'm so impressed with how, with just your words and your voice, you can make characters feel like we've known them forever and feel like we're right there in the place that you're creating. It's just simply marvelous. Can we get one more round of applause, please, for both? So I want to thank both Gania and Audrey for sharing their work with us tonight. They have given us a lot to think about and some creative ways of looking at the world. Our students are so fortunate to have you both as mentors, and we as your colleagues are lucky to be able to work and collaborate with you. I will put a call out for applications for the Bennett Writing Grant in the second semester, and I will encourage faculty from all departments to consider putting in an application. So we will close tonight's Bennett reading with the inscription from the 1959 Kingswood Yearbook, which was dedicated to Miss Bennett by her students with this inscription: Miss Bennett, you have illuminated for us, the great realm of literature from Moses to Mogam, our confused syntax and the confusing imagery of the modern poets have become clear under your teaching. Even when engulfed by book reports, critical papers, and clarion proofs, you have an encouraging word or a bracing comment for us. To obey your dictum, be specific. It is to you, Miss Bennett, that with love and respect we dedicate our woodwinds. And so we dedicate this night of reading to Miss Bennett and to all of the teachers and mentors who inspire us with their willingness to share their passions and talents. Thank you all for being a part of this evening and celebration tonight of our talented writers. Thank you so much.